And good morning, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives, and it is April 28th of 2025 already, 11:05 a.m. Apologize for being a little bit late, but we are continuing reading and making a few comments along the way of Anton Chaitkin's latest work, the second volume of his intended three-part volumes, three-part history of the United States, and that's called Who We Are. We send out our best wishes to him and his wife. I know there's a health struggle going on, and we certainly keep him in our thoughts and prayers, and his wife. He's one of the great contributors to the hidden history of our country that if we can just hang on to it, we can survive. We can get it back. You just have to be able to follow the trail backwards, as well as have the faith that people in the past were good people generally, that they did have the ideal of our country in mind when they were in positions of authority, and those that didn't got defeated. So if we can look at the past as a hopeful message to carry forward, that yes, look what we did. We had slavery. We had slavery in this country under the Constitution. And there was nothing that the federal government could do about it under the Constitution. Nevertheless, somehow, and with the great sacrifice of millions of people, that mistake, that grievous error has been erased, at least in official terms. We still have many other forms of slavery, of course, but universal progress is not a lie. We do have many, many people right now learning the lessons of the past. And if we can take advantage of the work, the lifelong work of Anton Chaitkin to help inform the future with a narrative that works for humanity, that works for our country, for our future, for our sovereignty, and for the world, then I think that progress will continue and the future can be bright. We left off on page 88 of the text. This is a pre-printed text that Tony sent me. I am not reading from the actual published book, which you can get at Amazon. But we left off with this quote from Lincoln: "Universal slavery will soon be upon us, unless the power of the present political dynasty shall be met and overthrown." Does that not apply to today just as well as it did in 1861 or 59, whenever it was? And notice he doesn't say universal race-based slavery, although that was what he meant at the time. The fact is that slavery has existed ever since the first empires. And if you are living in an empire, then you are a slave, whether you have certain privileges or not. When it comes right down to it, when the empire decides that your usefulness is over, they will get rid of you. And those people that we see trying to change things in this country that get eliminated are examples of the persistence of that same empire in our world today. And when you see a Klaus Schwab promoting that you will be happy when you own nothing, then that the veil is off. That is them. They are promoting that we should voluntarily accept slavery for ourselves, no matter what color we are. So that's why I think this is so vital that we have the courage to preserve the American dream, if you will, as a positive idea that we can somehow get back to and transmit to our future generations. During the ensuing campaign, he engaged Douglas in a series of senatorial campaign debates. Lincoln narrowly lost to Douglas as the legislature's choice of senator, but won acclaim as a forceful spokesman against the slave power. Lincoln spoke for the growing Northern determination to prevent the spread of slavery, to confine it where it would be, quote, in the course of ultimate extinction. But in the debates with Douglas, Lincoln said that under the Constitution, the federal government was not permitted to pass laws abolishing slavery in states that legalized it. Think about that for a second. You know, over in right across the river in Mount Vernon in Virginia, we have a very, very able impersonator of George Washington with that beautiful stentorian voice and everything. I haven't seen him in person, but I watched a little video of him, and he confronted the question as he says, "You ask why the although you're against it, that you allow slavery to persist." And President Washington's answer is, "I do not. The federal government does not have the power to end slavery. It just wasn't there. It wasn't in the Constitution, according to George Washington." And this is the same thing that Lincoln is saying here in the 1850s. The government doesn't have that power. Wow. You mean it's a limited federal government? It only has certain powers? So there are things that President Trump can't do, right? There are things that the government itself can't do. At least that was true up until the end of the Civil War, when, along with the abolition of slavery, we brought in the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, prohibition of violation of individual rights enumerated in the Bill of Rights. Well, all of those Bill of Rights apply to everybody now, and the federal government does enforce them. Whether that's a good thing or not, what would Lincoln say? Yes, we need the federal government to enforce the human rights that are guaranteed in the Constitution. Moreover, the owners of large slave plantations threatened war in case of federal interference. How then did Lincoln envision slavery being brought to extinction? All his adult life, Lincoln had followed Henry Clay, Matthew Carey, and his son Henry Carey in their commitment to reviving the U.S. founding program for industrialization, Alexander Hamilton's protective tariffs, national banking, and federally sponsored transport facilities. An underlying premise of this program was that, and this is underlined and italicized by Tony Chaitkin to emphasize it. An underlying premise of this program was that creating machine-intensive modern industry in the South would raise the value of labor there. It would cause disinvestment in slave agriculture in favor of more profitable, skilled labor factories and scientific family farming, unquote. Since the founding of the United States, with African slavery still in place as a remnant of the British Empire, this American system economic policy was always the road to extinguishing slavery in America without civil war. Of course, changing the character of the South in this way required holding the Union together with Republicans in control so that the transformative power of the national government could be applied in that region. Isn't that remarkable that such a plan of manipulating half of the United States, the whole South, converting it into a northern economy, was the overall idea, at least from the economic point of view. It's interesting how that fits in with the economic interests of those investors in industry in the North. Can we say that is universal progress just to substitute a northern industrial wage system for the agricultural system that was based on slavery? Is there not a better agricultural system that would not be based on slavery? But that was the wisdom of the times, to industrialize. And by deindustrializing our country today, it's very obvious that that's taking us backwards. It's taking us into back into the pre-Civil War days when most people were making what living they could out of the land that they owned, and labor was very, very, very cheap indeed. Carey, how to extinguish the slave trade. This logic was developed explicitly by Henry Carey in his explosive 1853 book, The Slave Trade, Domestic and Foreign, Why It Exists and How It May Be Extinguished. Carey warns his readers at the outset that his views, quote, differ widely from those generally entertained, both as regards the cause of evil and the mode of cure. He then presents the scorching truth about the global slave labor system, of which African slavery in America was a subordinate part. His fearless expose resounds through all subsequent U.S. history to the present day, as we shall see. Carey shows that the British promoted slavery in America through hegemony of their trade system, together with outright trade wars, and promoted slavery in all but name in Ireland and India through direct imperial control. The British acted, quote, to prevent the application of labor elsewhere than in England to any pursuit but that of agriculture. to compel whole populations to produce the same commodities, and thus to deprive them of the power to make exchanges among themselves. To compel them, therefore, to export to England all their produce in its rudest forms at great cost of transportation. To deprive them of all power of returning to the land the animal and vegetable waste yielded by its products, and thus to compel them to exhaust their land. To deprive them of the power of associating together for the building of towns, the establishment of schools, the making of roads, or the defense of their rights. To compel them with every step in the process of exhausting the land, to increase their distances from each other and from market, to compel the waste of all labor that could not be employed in the field, to prevent increase in the value of land and in the demand for labor of man, and thus to prevent advance towards civilization and freedom." Unquote. What Carey says of the African slave trade itself is particularly hard-hitting because the methods used persisted after that trade was ended, continuing to the present day under the globalist system. The British coerced Africans to sell their people into slavery by suppressing Black Africa's own productive capabilities, and that is underlined, so that the value of an African was higher as a slave sold to them than as a worker employed at home. And they exported guns into Africa, which armed those who sold captives to foreigners and caused other forms of mayhem. Carey wrote, quote, "For 2 centuries it had been deemed desirable to have from Africa the same, quote, inexhaustible supply of cheap labor, unquote, that Ireland has supplied to England, and therefore no effort was spared to prevent the Negroes from making any improvement in their modes of cultivation." "The truth is," said Mr. Pitt in 1791, quote, "there is no nation in Europe which has plunged so deeply into this guilt as Britain. We stopped the natural progress of civilization in Africa. We cut her off from the opportunity of improvement. We kept her down in a state of darkness, bondage, ignorance, and bloodshed. We have there subverted the whole order of nature. We have aggravated every natural barbarity and furnished to every man motives for committing, under the name of trade, acts of perpetual hostility and perfidy against his neighbor. We had obtained as yet only so much knowledge of its productions as to show that there was a capacity for trade, which we checked." Wow. To me, that's breathtaking that Henry Carey wrote that. And Mr. Pitt, I assume, was at the time the prime minister in 1791, said it. That's exactly what John F. Kennedy was speaking of in his inauguration speech, that we want to offer to Africa a helping hand to develop their own resources, to develop their own industry, to create their own future with a positive, growing economy. Well, I think it's evident that that empire that is built on slavery and that ultimately owns every human being under its command, under its jurisdiction, is still the strongest force on this planet today. That's my comment. How was all this done? By preventing the poor Africans from obtaining machinery to enable them to prepare their sugar for market, or for producing cotton and indigo and combining them into cloth. Guns and gunpowder, traded for slaves, aided in providing cheaper labor. Carey explains that the British also used semi-enslaved labor, deliberately kept unskilled, to produce African goods for the imperial system. Quote, it is deemed now desirable to have cheap labor applied to the collection of gold dust and hides, palm leaves and ivory, and a description of commodities at present exported to Africa will be seen by the following cargo list of the brig Lily: 50 tons of gunpowder, 20 puncheons rum, a quantity of firearms, and some bale goods. Such are not the commodities required for raising the value of man in Africa, and until it can be raised to a level with his value in slave plantations in Cuba, the export of men will be continued from the African coast as certainly as the export from Ireland will be continued so long as men are cheaper there than elsewhere. Unquote. Slavery may be ended, Carey writes, only by raising the value of labor. We here paraphrase Carey's documented and well-reasoned polemic on how this may be accomplished in Africa and in the American South. Point 1. Supply machinery to Africa and let Africa use its own vast resources to create skilled industry and produce crops for home consumption. This will induce competition among international buyers of agricultural products. Africans could build powerful, truly independent nations. This is the core idea of those who have fought until today for Africa's freedom against the continuing imperial blockade on African development. Point 2. Put manufacturing into Virginia alongside the exhausted soil plantations, so that selling slaves to the Western states is not the only profitable transaction. Wow, I have to stop and say, that's the history of Southern Maryland. The slave plantations, they had their 200 years or whatever it was, but they burned up the soil so bad that it wasn't no longer profitable to have slaves here in Southern Maryland. And so they were sold. They were sold off down the river. And, that's the legacy of the whole eastern seaboard in the South, that the land got burned out. And it basically, is still, nowhere near the fertility that the first English settlers found when they landed here. And I don't know if it'll ever be that again. Anyway, that's just a local reality that is reflected well in this book. Blacks could develop skills profitably to their employers, and black and white workers would come down from the north. Farms supplying varied food and fiber to new industrial towns would enrich rather than deplete the soil. The price of farm goods would rise with a new demand, while the value of labor would rise as employers compete with one another. To implement this change would be chiefly a matter of U.S. national policy, through protective tariffs, credit and money supply, and building supportive infrastructure. Thus, Carey proposed to end slavery. Excuse me a second. Thus, Carey proposed to end slavery by ending Southern backwardness and overturning the British Empire. The failure to industrialize the American South, even after the Union victory in the Civil War, would leave in place a dangerous, feudalistic Confederate influence in American life and politics. Just like Lincoln and Carey, later U.S. leaders, the best of them, would see poverty and oppression as rooted in feudal conditions imposed by imperialism. Franklin Roosevelt would fight Southern backwardness with the enormous Tennessee Valley Project, During World War II, Roosevelt would attack British and French policy that kept Africa centuries behind the times. This revived American philosophy would inspire a new generation of African nationalists. In 1957, U.S. civil rights organizer Martin Luther King would meet Kwame Nkrumah, the leader of Ghana's fight for independence from the British Empire. After his return home, Dr. King would say, quote, Ghana was a one-crop country, cocoa mainly. In order to make the economic system more stable, it would be necessary to industrialize. Nkrumah said to me that one of the first things he would do, parentheses, as Ghana's first prime minister, close parentheses, would be to work toward industrialization, unquote. John F. Kennedy would champion African nationalism on his path to the White House. As president, he would sponsor Nkrumah's great hydroelectric project aimed at industrializing West Africa. Dr. King would write in 1963, quote, the American South is fissuring along a seam which divides the industrializing regions from the stagnating, backward agricultural areas. This is significant because the new social and political attitudes are rooted in economic necessity. New industry will not come where dying customs create social tensions, second-rate education, and cities without the cultural institutions required for the technical personnel of modern industry. Unquote. The combined political forces of the civil rights movement, labor unions, enlightened industrial leaders, and the Kennedy White House would be driving towards a new paradigm of world progress when first John Kennedy, then Dr. King, and then John's brother Robert Kennedy would each be assassinated. Abolitionists, the Union, and the two mothers' appeal to King Solomon. Stephen Douglas assailed Lincoln and his party as, quote, black Republican abolitionists. But many abolitionists attacked Republicans as a morally compromised, failed party. In the late 1850s, those who called for immediate abolition of slavery were divided on the question of sustaining the U.S. Constitution and the Union of States. The most radical abolitionists agreed with the slave owners that the Constitution was pro-slavery. They proposed that the North should secede from the Union so that Northerners could live without being complicit in the crime of slavery. A, quote, disunion convention, unquote, had been met in Massachusetts in January 1857 following the Republicans' defeat by Buchanan. Most of the attending activists were driven by rage and despair over slavery. The meeting's principal organizers, Thomas W.S. Higginson and the famous William Lloyd Garrison, had long-standing ties to the British Empire and its tireless intrigues against American independence. Disunion would have left the shrunken USA surrounded by the hostile British colony of Canada to the north and an aggressive British-aligned slave empire to the south. And of course, with the nation cut in two pieces, slavery would still continue in the southern piece. This brings to mind the Bible story of the two women who argued before King Solomon over which was the actual mother of a certain child. One of them thought Solomon's suggestion of cutting the child in half would be a fair solution to the dispute, revealing that she could not be the real mother. Frederick Douglass, the famed escaped slave and abolition crusader, had originally shared Garrison's views, but he had split with Garrison in the early 1850s, writing that, quote, I have about decided to let slaveholders and their northern abettors be responsible for putting a pro-slavery interpretation upon the Constitution. I am sick and tired of arguing on the slaveholders' side of this question. Remaining a harsh critic of white Americans, Frederick Douglass would be a monumental figure in the recruitment of 200,000 black soldiers, the crucial margin of strength for the Union victory. He would be the most important spokesman for the right of Black people to be educated in and possess all that human genius has created from all cultures and all ages. Arranging Lincoln's nomination. When the Republican convention in May 1860 chose Abraham Lincoln as the party's nominee, it was a shock to the other candidates, a surprise that had been prearranged by Republican leaders of the four swing states, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Illinois, and Indiana. It was the Carey Circle acting behind the scenes that moved the gears guiding the nomination apparatus on Lincoln's behalf. In the national crisis of 1860, Carey's decisive influence in molding the Republican Party's program gave him a degree of added leverage in the party's overall decision-making process. The pre-planned outcome of the convention, together with the return to protective tariffs, began an active Lincoln-Carey partnership that would guide American strategy for a surge of national strength. The history of that era is incomprehensible without reference to the cooperation and guidance of these two leaders. And that statement is printed in boldface and underlined by the author. In the present volume, we will observe this partnership when Carey and Thaddeus Stevens promote greenbacks, Chapter 4, when Carey-inspired railroad executives overcome anti-union sabotage of the Union's military logistics in Chapter 6, and then go on to create the nation's steel industry, Chapter 7, and when Carey's New Jersey political partner Thomas Dudley organizes the Union's critical intelligence apparatus inside England in Chapter 7. Let us then look inside the theatrical outer appearance of politics to see how choices really were made. Before the 1860 convention, it had been generally assumed that Senator William Seward of New York would be the party's choice among the several candidates. But many Republican activists were convinced that the radical Seward could not win the national election, and that, as the party's standard bearer, he would hurt the chances of local Republican candidates, and they were determined to block Seward's nomination. Lincoln had won broad respect and admiration, and his political outlook was similar to Seward's. His, quote, "house divided," unquote, statement cohered with Seward's famous warning of an irrepressible conflict. But Lincoln was less well known and thus had fewer enemies. Illinois Republicans solidly backed Lincoln, though most were not convinced he could win the nomination. The party in Indiana was against nominating Seward and leaned toward Lincoln. Pennsylvania and New Jersey remained as the centers of concern among the four swing states, which had all gone against the Republicans in 1856. To secure the necessary support of those two states, and thus gain unified backing in all four swing states, the Lincoln campaign coordinated strategy with Pennsylvania gubernatorial candidate Andrew G. Curtin and the New Jersey Republican chairman Thomas H. Dudley. Both men were closely associated with Henry Carey, not only as followers of his economic ideas, but in his capacity as a leading Republican political strategist in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Relevant political facts about the two states will supply some necessary background for understanding the process by which Lincoln's nomination was put together. In Pennsylvania, Republicans were divided into two bitterly contending factions, one led by U.S. Senator Simon Cameron, the other by Andrew Curtin and Henry Carey. Cameron was a wily politician who himself aimed at the presidency. A longtime former Democrat, his advocacy of a protective tariff gained him industrialists' backing, but Carey knew Cameron to be self-serving and untrustworthy. Former state school superintendent Andrew Curtin was devoted to Henry Clay's American system and was resolutely anti-slavery. Curtin co-owned a central Pennsylvania ironworks built by his family, and he looked to Henry Carey as a political partner and teacher. At the Republican State Convention in February 1860, Curtin had secured the nomination for governor with Carey's help against Cameron's opposition, but the party had instructed the state's delegates to vote for Cameron's nomination for president at the National Convention to be held in May. In New Jersey, the Republican chairman Thomas H. Dudley was a lifelong Whig who had named his first child after Henry Clay. Dudley was Henry Carey's close friend and Carey's student and disciple from the 1850s until well after Carey's death in 1879. Dudley was a deeply religious Quaker, avid for justice. His first case as a practicing attorney had been to rescue a local free black mother and her 3 children who had been kidnapped into slavery. Dudley had headed south heavily armed and dressed in the style of a slave trader. He caught up with the fugitives in Maryland and risked his life, conning them into selling their captives to him. Dudley's resourcefulness and cool head fitted him well for leadership in the pre-Civil War political crisis, and during the war when he would direct a network of American Secret Service operatives inside Britain. Preparing for the Republican convention, Henry Carey was advising Dudley, a member of New Jersey's delegation, on the strategy for preventing Seward's nomination. Seward himself believed in protection to industry, but a factor to be considered in Carey's antipathy to Seward's nomination is that though Seward and his manager Thurlow Weed were the predominant power in the Republican Party of New York, they did not determine that organization's political views. New York Republicans were an amalgam of pro-national protectionists and Anglophile Wall Street free traders. And Carey considered Wall Street a perfidious adjunct to America's imperial London enemy. Well, just to take a breath and say, I think that's still the case, isn't it? In a letter dated April 1st, Carey wrote that, quote, Seward is crazy. He told me last night that there was going to be an uprising of the people in his favor, and he had never before been seen. What can be done with him? Carey also hit at Pennsylvania's Senator Cameron for refusing to give up his own candidacy. Carey counseled Dudley on coordinating the 2 states' delegations, first to reach agreement among New Jersey delegates on a short list, and then following that up by addressing a letter to all of our Pennsylvania delegates in which each should be asked to say how far he agreed with you and where he differed. A week later, Carey asked Dudley, try to come over here, that we may have a talk. Carey's closest allies among the Pennsylvania and New Jersey delegates conferred and coordinated their plans, as indicated by Pennsylvania Congressman George W. Scranton's report to Carey 2 weeks before the convention. Quote, I have written to one of my friends, a delegate to Chicago from Pennsylvania, stating to him in substance the views you expressed in relation to the proposed conference between New Jersey and Pennsylvania before they meet in Chicago. He is personally acquainted with 2 or 3 of the New Jersey delegates and will be likely to meet some or all of them several times before the convention. At the convention in mid-May, Seward initially had the broadest national support. Seward's rivals had national stature but mainly localized backing. Illinois Republicans met a week before the national convention and unanimously endorsed Lincoln for president, but probably few then expected he would win the nomination. The other main candidates were Ohio's Governor Salmon Chase, Missouri's old Whig leader Edward Bates, Pennsylvania's Simon Cameron, and William Dayton, New Jersey's Attorney General. Dayton was close to Carey. He would cooperate in the Carey plan. Lincoln, as president, would appoint Dayton minister to France. There he would work in tandem with Dudley as consul in Liverpool in diplomatic and covert intelligence efforts to block European support for the Southern Confederacy. The Cary Circle at the 1860 Republican Convention. Seward and the whole political world were sure he would be nominated for president. He was stunned by the party's choice of Lincoln, and though Seward went on to serve with distinction as Secretary of State, his resentment would endure. Years later, Seward gave the following account of what had happened, testifying to Thomas Dudley's decisive role in his disappointment at the convention, but angrily attributing to Dudley corrupt motives for having snatched the nomination away from him. Quote, the delegates to the Chicago Convention, which nominated Mr. Lincoln for president, were expected to be and were really for him, Seward. But Dayton became ambitious, wanted first to be president. Failing in that, wanted to be vice president, and seeing that he was likely to fail in both, Dudley sold out New Jersey to Lincoln and carried the delegation from that state for Lincoln instead of for him, Seward, and made Lincoln the presidential candidate on condition that he should make Dayton minister to France and Dudley consul to Liverpool, unquote. Putting aside Seward's unsupported charge of a corrupt deal, his assertion that Dudley made Lincoln the presidential candidate refers to the well-known fact that the four states' leaders, including Dudley, privately agreed upon the nomination before the convention voting began. Historians have heretofore supplied limited accounts of this pre-planning, but these events are here fully presented for the first time. Readers will be able to judge for themselves the importance of knowing how Cary and his Philadelphia Circle, men in a bitter contest against the imperial globalists of their day, helped guide the choice of Abraham Lincoln as president. And so I think I will call it right here. It's page 103, about halfway down the page on my copy of Who We Are by Anton Chaitkin. And just take a moment to say hi to folks at the chat room. Hello, Brightmore and Corky, Kathy Sue. All right, and Kathy Sue has a wrench. So glad to have you back here, Kathy. Brightmore, Corky, everybody else, have a great afternoon. I look forward to talking to you tomorrow with the great Harley Schlanger for our biweekly updates. So join us then, 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Bye now.